this event. And because we're going to have a full crowd, I need people to scoot as close as you can. It's going to be, like a full church. Scoot together. We don't want to bring extra chairs in because, of course, we don't want people blocking the aisleways. But we'd like everybody to be comfortable during this. Welcome, welcome. I'm so happy to see so many people spend their valuable time on a Saturday who just want to know about our education system in this country, and especially our system and how it's being operated in the state of Ohio. I really appreciate you taking your time, and I have to say that I extremely appreciate the time of our panelists, because again, they're taking their free time away from their families, to come here and help us understand Common Core. And I don't know about you, but I'm just so appreciative of that time. We all need to know. I am Kelly Coles, and I'm the president of the Ohio School Board Leadership Council. We have put this on today at our own expense just to help Ohio citizens understand Common Core. I'm also the president of my school board, Springboro School Board, and I have to say, I don't understand Common Core. And that's a flag. If our school board members don't understand Common Core, what the heck is it and why do we have it? And that's what I said. So, I said, let's get this common. I don't know what I just said, but I think that led me to believe it was very, very important that we understand what is going on, that we understand the pros and the cons. And so that's why we're here today, that's why we put this on. We have a videotape happening today of our event, and we want to put this videotape on our website. So it's right on the front of that brochure, osblc.com.org.net, it'll all get you there. But we wanted this available to members. And we're no dummies. We need membership to survive, and we need membership to have electoral impact. We all know how this works. We are a conservative organization that is coaching school board members to hold the education systems in their communities accountable. Okay? Fiscally, academically, process, procedures, policies. So we're a little bit different than what's been out there before. We're brand new. We need help. We certainly love donations, but your membership will help us keep doing this kind of thing. So it's $40 a year. You go on there. We're going to have a membership-only page. If you have a membership, you can go access this video. And that's kind of how we're getting things done today. I want to introduce, first of all, Chris Finney, who is our moderator for today. And I really appreciate him coming. He's done this before. He's got some expertise, which I do not have. Mr. Finney is a shareholder in the firm where he concentrates in commercial and constitutional litigation, as well as matters of real estate law and title to real estate. Chris is going to tell you a little bit more about himself, and then he's going to introduce our speakers. So we've got 30 minutes for each side to give their ideas of what the pros are, their ideas of what the opposition is to Common Core. Then we're going to be followed by 15 minutes for each side to rebut maybe some points that were made by the other side, and then we will open it up to audience questions. So right at that point, I'll ask people to get their cards over to us. Thank you all for coming today. Mr. Finney.
Thank you, Kelly. First of all, Kelly didn't do this, so I will. OSBLC, how many of you here are members or know about it? Anybody? All right, well, we're going to get 200, Kelly, we're going to get 200 or 300 new members today because everybody else is going to join. On the back of your brochure is the website, and you join through the website. It's $40 a year, and it's a fantastic organization that is providing an alternative point of view from the organization that's funded by tax dollars primarily that is out there now. And at least consider the alternative and try to support what Kelly's doing for this forum and for the other things that she's doing. She needs the, she's a startup organization and is just giving everything she's got to make this happen. So I want to thank her for that. We also have Deb Terhar here. I want to recognize the president of the Ohio State Board of Education. She is an amazingly energetic woman that gets all over the state making all kinds of stuff happen. We appreciate that. And I'm excited about the energy that all of you people bring today, the citizen activism and commitment that we see on a host of issues around the state where people give their time, energy, and intellect is very much appreciated. We've got an incredible panel today, and we're both going to be listening. As Kelly said, they're each side, pro-Common Core and anti-Common Core are going to get a half hour, and I think everybody's agreed just to do 10 minutes each. We got the pro side here, the anti side here, then a good 15 minutes of rebuttal, then we're going to take Q&A. And just so we're clear on the Q&A side, we have a limited amount of time for this, so we don't want speeches, and I think that we have generally, although I don't know the full mix of the audience, probably a pretty conservative audience, but we want to be very respectful for all of our speakers today and the points of views that are presented. So think about your question, try to make it as quick as possible. We'll introduce you with your school district and jurisdiction and county, and then let you ask your question. And hopefully we'll get through as many of those as possible. So I'm going to do the introductions real quick. And I feel very diminished here, by the way. Let me just introduce myself. I'm Chris Finney, and as Kelly said, I do constitutional law. One of the things my firm does, and one of the reason Kelly is familiar with me, is that we do sort of school board accountability stuff in our law firm. Open meetings, public records. But the other thing that we do a lot of, and I was just talking to Deb about this, is holding school boards accountable not to use tax dollars for campaign purposes. And we do a lot of litigation in that area and try to put the lid on it. If anybody's interested in talking to me about that afterwards, I'll stay around and be glad to talk to you about that in your jurisdiction. We find it's epidemic in a lot of districts. But with that, like I said, my resume I feel a little diminished because we've got an incredibly talented panel. And everybody's resume is in your book except for Jamie Gass, so I'm going to let him, and this is not Emmett, I found out. Okay, so we'll put that up. Emmett is going to reserve time for rebuttal because they've got 4 on 3. So Emmett's going to come up and switch spaces on the last 15 minutes. But this is Jamie Gass, and we'll let him introduce himself and talk about his area. Why don't you go first, Jamie?
Sure. Hi, good morning, folks. My name is Jamie Gass. I'm director of the Center for School Reform at Pioneer Institute, which is a Boston-based think tank that was one of the big drivers behind a lot of the successes in Massachusetts in the 1990s and early 2000s.
We appreciate it. Emmy Parton is the Director of Ohio Policy and Research for the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. And again, she's got an amazing resume that's in your book. Todd Jones is the President and General Counsel of the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities. He served in the U.S. Department of Education under George W. Bush and had a role in the first Bush administration as well.
Well, I was on Capitol Hill.
On Capitol Hill at that time. And is a member of the Ohio Board of Education. Emmett McGroarty, who is out here, is on the anti-side, and he's going to be on rebuttal. He's the Executive Director of the American Principles Project. Over here, I'm sorry, who else did I forget? Oh, Andrew Brenner is a state representative in his second term in the Ohio House from Powell. He's the Vice Chair of the Education Committee, and actually has, you're going to present the pro point of view, but you actually have mixed points of view on Common Core, and so you're going to do your best to present the pro side for purposes of the debate today. Then we have 2 Hoosiers over here, Heather Crossan and Joy Pullman, with the Hoosiers Against Common Core, and I read an article this morning about a presentation you all made in Cincinnati last night. I'm sorry I missed it, but thank you all for coming. So with that, I really want to just get into the program. My primary responsibility, don't think I'm looking at my phone, is to run the stopwatch on my phone and to give these guys their go. So we're going to give the pro side first. Emmy, do you want to start? I'll give you the 3-minute countdown and the 1 minute if you watch for my signals.
Can you hear me? We're done. Okay. As you said, I'm Emmy Parton, Ohio Policy Director for the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. We're a right-of-center education policy think tank. We're based in Washington, D.C., but we do significant work in the state of Ohio because Dayton was where Thomas Fordham lived and where he made his money that now still funds the work we do today. We promote education reforms of all types with a particular focus on school choice, funding that follows the child, and standards-based reform. In Ohio, we also authorize charter schools. I joined Fordham about 5 years ago. Before that, I worked for the Ohio Department of Education and in the office of Governor Bob Taft. I'm also concerned about education as a mom. My son is a kindergartner at Cranbrook Elementary in Columbus. I'm really pleased to be here today because the Common Core is an important topic for the public to understand. Transitioning to the Common Core means a major shift in the education of millions of school children. Thus, perhaps more than any other reform, it needs to be understood and valued by moms, dads, and community members. Dialogues like this one are important, and I applaud you for putting it together and coming out and being here today on Saturday morning. Let me say straight out, I wholeheartedly support the Common Core, yes, as an education policy professional, but more so as a parent. I want higher, more rigorous, and relevant standards that will help put my son on the path to success later in life. Before I talk about the Common Core, I want to make clear, though, what standards are and what they are not, because I think most of you are not educators. Standards are guidance to educators. They set the floor for what children should know and the skills they need to acquire at each grade level. Standards are not a curriculum. Teachers and school districts have vast latitude over what is actually taught and how it's taught in the classroom. You can see evidence of this today. A 10th grader at East High School in Columbus and one at Reynoldsburg High School, just 9 miles down the road, don't have identical education experiences, despite being, just 9 miles apart. But there's a basic amount of knowledge and skills that both should be learning. Ohio's existing standards were enacted in legislation in 2001 and have been updated since then. Before then, local school districts decided what to teach and when, and it differed greatly. My mom was an elementary school teacher in a district adjacent to ours. I remember being in 3rd grade when the grade she taught and realizing she was teaching things I wasn't learning. I can remember her teacher, teacher edition textbooks, and there was stuff in there that I'd never seen, and by 4th and 5th grade had never seen. So that's what standards are. Now about the Common Core. The Common Core standards are different from most state standards because they are designed to ensure that students stay on course toward college and career readiness throughout school. They were written and adopted by governors and state boards of education, 45 states in the District of Columbia. They are more focused on rigorous back-to-basics content than the majority of state standards they replace. And in fact, that's the #1 reason that I think Ohio should stay on board with the Common Core. They are simply better than what we have in place right now. My organization has long rated state standards for their quality of content and rigor. Our experts have given the Common Core math standards an A-, giving Ohio's a C. In English, we gave the Common Core a B+, Ohio a C. We found that much of Ohio's standards were vague or missing altogether, and that too much core content was covered in a superficial fashion, a mile wide and an inch deep, that wouldn't ensure kids learn the material. I will speak to parents on that regard. If you've experienced your child coming home every day with a different worksheet or homework assignment on a new topic every single day, like they're just whizzing through what they have to learn, that's because Ohio's current standards are a mile wide and an inch deep. The Common Core will change that. Teachers will be able to go more in depth in important topic areas with your kids. As a mother, those facts are the most important to me. If you're going to change up the education my son receives, it must only be for the better. The Common Core standards have received bipartisan support from day one, nationally and in Ohio. Yes, President Obama supports them, but so do Republicans like Jeb Bush, Fordham Institute President Checker Fenn, who was an official in the Education Department under President Reagan, Florida Superintendent and former Indiana Superintendent Tony Bennett, and others. In Ohio, the Common Core has been embraced by folks who are all political ill as well. Now I'll speak locally. The Common Core standards present an opportunity for some cost savings and collaboration for local schools. By joining the Common Core, Ohio schools can take advantage of the huge amount of investment that other states, private foundations, and companies are putting into Common Core aligned textbooks, ebooks, professional development, online learning, on and on. What's more, schools won't be restricted to collaborating with districts in Ohio or vendors that are familiar with Ohio's education system. Under the Common Core, local school leaders can reach out to schools and providers in 45 states plus DC. The Cleveland School District is already doing this, partnering on Common Core implementation work with other large city districts like Baltimore. It's a valid worry that the Common Core will result in more testing, but implemented well at the local level, that doesn't have to be the case. Consider a 4th grader in Ohio. He spends 5 hours each spring taking state math and reading tests. He also spends about 5 hours earlier in the year taking district-issued tests, like the Stanford 10, which Dublin administers, or the Iowa Test of Basic Skills. That's 10 hours a year. The 4th grade Common Core tests also will take about 10 hours, but those are spread out over the year. The new tests will have end-of-year exams, but also ones given at several points throughout the year. Because these formative during-the-year tests are aligned with the standards the student is learning in the classroom, they are a better measure of his academic achievement than the ones the district is giving now. Districts could use these tests to replace the supplemental ones they give now. And teachers would have real information about how students are progressing toward the end-of-year standards. Districts would save money because the Common Core aligned tests are administered by the state and largely paid for by the state. To close, the Common Core will bolster the education Ohio children receive and boost their future success. Those children are the future of our state. Anyone who cares about the state of this state in 10, 20, 30 years from now should support state and local implementation of the Common Core. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
The first request I'm going to make, and by the way, can you hear me at the back of the room? Okay, good. Is a point of personal privilege that I thought was coming because I didn't want to cough to death on stage, and that would be rather awkward. Okay, well, okay.
I can't hear you.
Okay, well then that helps. There's a danger with that. I speak rather forcefully, so if you're leaning back, then I'll understand I've gone too far. I'm going to give you a little background about myself, in part not for purposes of self-aggrandizement, because I think it's relevant to the topics we're talking about today. But you can read my bio in the little booklet. And I'm going to offer you 4 truisms and 9 points about our topic of discussion today that I'd like to provide to you. The first is a little bit of background. Can you hold that for a second? Or I'll let you hold that. I'm multitasking. I've seen multiple administrations, congressional leaders, congressional committees, different avenues of policy in my career. I know the limitations of elected conservatives because I've seen it up close and personally, and people you regard as conservative firebrands are sometimes up close, not quite what you think that they are on education. Secondly, I'm more than willing to admit what I don't know, and so if you ask me questions and my answer is I don't know, please take it as a sign of respect to you that I'm not going to try and buffalo you. And lastly, this isn't my first education rodeo. I've been around education reform for a couple decades in the political trenches, and I've seen a number of things, and I'm going to close with one of them to give you a little perspective on that. Let me start with the truisms. One is what Emmy said initially. There's a difference between curriculum and standards. And sometimes that gets fuzzed over in people's heads, but I want you to focus on it. Standards are the benchmarks that we're trying to ensure that everyone understands, and curriculum is how you go about implementing it. And we do not have a French Ministry of Education here. We do not dictate from the national level what curriculum looks like and have it flow down, which doesn't work anyway. And in fact, Ohio embraces local control more than most states. My second truism is conservatives are very bad at knowing when they've won. I want you to think about that. One of the weaknesses of the conservative movement is not being able to understand when you have won on a policy matter and it gets driven into the ground and harmed by an attempt to just drive it out to that last percentage of perfection. Now, by the way, liberals overreach. That's their main issue of contention. Some states do want to dumb down standards. You need to be aware of that, and this state historically has been one of them. It's too much. Our children are demoralized, our teachers are demoralized, our children's self-esteem is hurt. Those policy leaders really are out there. I also want you to know that Washington will never, ever control curriculum. First of all, liberals don't want it. I'm going to repeat that. Yeah, I expected that reaction. I'm going to say it again just for effect. Washington will never control curricula. And I can say that because I've been inside the U.S. Department of Education. They lack the tools to do it. They lack the inclination because they believe that education reformers in the conservative vein will actually implement things that they don't want to have. The idea that Bible reading will be incorporated into curricula is a secret fear of a large number of the popular folks on the liberal side of the education reform movement. I kid you not, they lack the ability to do it. They lack the interest to do it because they know what will happen as conservatives move in. And unlike healthcare, they lack the leverage to do it. There isn't enough money to force locals to do it. And that's a big difference, and we can talk about that more in Q&A. And lastly, this administration, the Obama administration, particularly lacks the ability to do this. For a little background, although there's this idea of the Obama administration as a very effective political machine, the fact is most of the education reform proposals that come out of the Obama administration emanate from one woman, started, and the support of a handful of foundations. Her name is actually Carmel Martin. You've probably never heard of her. She's a senior advisor to the secretary. But Carmel is the driving force behind the policies that move forward here. She started working for Jeff Bingaman. I knew her back then. She moved on to Ted Kennedy's staff, and she moved in the administration. Since that time, Arne Duncan has taken a more significant role, but they lack the brain power at the top in ways that, frankly, a number of the other administrations have had, both Republican and Democrat, to make that occur. They don't have the ability to implement a national curriculum. So let's talk about the Common Core. First off, I'm going to posit that the biggest problem with the Common Core is not the core itself, but how the Obama administration is attempting to implement it. The Obama administration is using extra legal means by overriding the explicit provisions of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, known as the No Child Left Behind Act under the Bush administration, to modify plans that states submit to the federal government to comply with that federal law. And because that federal law was going to require money to be taken away from states in 2013, 2014, and 2015, because you weren't meeting the goals that you set a number of years ago, the Obama administration did an end run and said, we'll grant you waivers to that. Sad fact here, the Republicans in Congress and the most conservative among them are actually complicit with this. They are willing to let this occur because they don't want to go through a negotiation which they believe they will lose, particularly how the political order is currently stacked in Washington, to reauthorize the Elementary and Secondary Education Act with Republicans controlling only one House of Congress. They are complicit in what has happened. So the problem is not the substance, although we'll talk about that. The problem is the means, the greater problem is the means. And for all the concern that I've heard about Common Core, I'm going to ask this question because I've asked it before. I want you to raise your hand and tell me if you've contacted your state, your U.S. representative or one of our two senators about not about the Common Core, about the Obama administration using the waiver process to implement its agenda. Please show your hands.
We didn't know about it. We didn't know
Okay,
about
now, I understand that, but I want to make a point that part of what you have going now is something that has been very well covered in the popular media and in the public domain, and everyone has just allowed it to occur. And coming late to that debate is one of the difficulties of the position we're in now. Secondly, the Common Core is what conservatives have been publicly stating that they have wanted to see as an end for years and years and years. The education reform movement largely goes back to the early 90s when the first George Bush had the Governor's Summit in Richmond. And one of the outcomes of that was a desire that we have a standards-based model for state accountability, or standards-based model for state goals for education. And that is advanced through successive large policy movements over time. In the early Bush administration, the second President Bush actually would have gone more aggressively at creating a standards-based curriculum, but he knew, or a standards-based model, but he knew that that couldn't happen because the liberals feared that there would be a Texas-style standards movement that went into it. And secondly, a large number of states, and I watched it firsthand, are very interested in achieving number goals, not achieving in substance. And they have successively dumbed down their standards over the years to have lesser standards so that their education establishment looks better. Don't forget that has happened. And when you look at why the Common Core happened, the Common Core goes back to, for those of you that are old enough, remember the standards of learning from Virginia, the very cutting edge of the standards movement in the 90s? Why did everyone on the right love it so much? It's because it had explicit high standards. When Massachusetts successfully moved high standards through in the 1990s, and the state of Ohio chose to dumb down its standards, why did that happen? It happened because the public in Ohio said, those are too tough, that's too much for our students to have, and Massachusetts stuck with the program. Well, it's the substance of those standards that we're talking about with the Common Core to convince other states to move things forward. Point number 3, the Common Core is federalism, not federal direction. Now, I want to put aside the way the Obama administration has funded it and underwritten it and encouraged the Council of Chief State School Officers to help draft it, but at the end of the day, this is, and the extra legal means of implementing the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, but at the end of the day, this is a group of states getting together and deciding to be in or not be in. Massachusetts is not in. It views its standards as being higher than the Common Core. I think they're right. In the state of Ohio, and there's some people who like to debate this, and frankly, I'm interested in hearing more of the debate, but from every review I've seen from conservative institutions, the standards are higher and more substantive than ours here in Ohio. By the way, let me also remind you, 1 minute? No, wait, it's 10 minutes. Can I have a couple of words? What's that?
Yeah, actually she did leave already.
That's right, so can I use a couple of her minutes? Thank you. That's what I was hoping. I will also say, and I know we'll come back to this, arguments about literature being displaced by practical reading are both off base and being demonized in part because of the ham-handedness of the Obama administration. Talking about regulations that students are going to get to read as part of nonfiction reading is bogus. Biographies are going to be focused. You know, we're talking about Churchill and reading about Grant, or Mozart and Beethoven, or Gandhi and Martin Luther King. These are biographies. Op-eds and policy papers, and how to read them and evaluate them for their truthfulness. Works by Plato and Aquinas and Kant and Adam Smith and de Tocqueville and Marx and Hayek. By the way, I mentioned Marx specifically. One of the ways to understand... Could I finish, please? Okay. One of the reasons to understand why it's important that communism failed and socialism is the wrong path is to actually read the source material. How many in here have actually sat down and read more than one of Marx's books? Excellent. How many of your students in Ohio do you think have had the chance to read that? I think we know that. Also, local schools, even under Common Core, will still drive content and curriculum. Don't forget that. Frankly, I believe if Common Core had been in place 10 years ago, we would not have Obamacare today. Because one of the reasons is people would understand how to read policy documents and look through them and op-eds and understand when you're being spun and understand what is the substance behind it. I'll reaffirm, states will always be to drop out. I know people debate that. There isn't enough money to buy loyalty to this program. And I'll remind you, certain big programs like IDEA actually have had states opt out as recently as 20 years ago. If these standards, let me go to point F. If these tests and standards are not the ones we adopt, what do you want to adopt? What is the alternative? Because one thing I haven't seen for all the complaints about Common Core, and again, as you'll see, I have a little skepticism myself, but what's the alternative? I'm waiting for people to put the standards on the table and list more, and they're out there and they're possible. I think Massachusetts has a good example, but as somebody who's on the state school board, I want to assure you that just because you believe it's the right thing to do doesn't mean you can get it enacted in this state, as Representative Brenner, I'm sure we'll discuss here in a bit. If you think Ohio will do stronger standards than the Common Core right now, you're kidding yourself. I'll say that again. If you think Ohio wants stronger standards than this, you're kidding yourself. Because I'm already hearing the backlash from Republicans about raising standards in this state. And if you think the Republicans are complaining, wait till you hear from the constituencies that represent the lowest performing districts in the state. The Common Core, 1 minute, thank you. The Common Core doesn't prescribe content. It doesn't prescribe methods. And lastly, I believe the Common Core will collapse. Now, it's funny for me to support that by going all through that and saying it, but I believe ultimately the states are not going to agree on a common standard and a set of cut scores, or they're going to break apart because they're going to lower the standards and we're going to leave. But it's an important process because it's going to lead to whatever the tests and assessments we use, it's going to cut their cost, and it's going to lead us to higher standards. And if you don't think that we're going to end up with higher standards, my great worry is we're going to end up with lower standards than we had, when right now the OGT is an 8th grade test given to 10th graders to graduate at 12th grade. That's what we have in Ohio. I'll add one last piece, and then I'm going to pass it over to my colleague here. I've been around a long time in conservative education circles. And back in 1994, when the Republicans took power, and I moved to Capitol Hill as an attorney, the Heritage Foundation, which I've loved for years and still deeply respect, put out an education policy piece. And among the pieces in it, it called for the repeal of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So we shouldn't fund it, give the money to the states and be done with it. Now, there's a lot of problems with that, and I can talk about the substances as we go to it, not the least of which is any state that opts out of IDEA will guarantee that its superintendents and school board members have their names on landmark cases litigated before federal courts for the next 30 years. You're crazy to do it. So, but let's assume that you did. 2 years later, they put out a second piece of education policy standard and said, no longer had the support of, or no longer called for the repeal of IDEA. And so I called him up and I said, what's going on? Why is Fordham doing this? I'm sorry, why is Heritage doing this? Or Fordham didn't do it. Why? Well, we had a change in personnel. I think the reality is that something got in the way, and that is the reality of actually implementing what was discussed. And as a result, the support of the bill shifted to actually be, we need to fund IDEA first. That's how policy circles sometimes move in conservative movements, for those that aren't familiar in education. And I want you to watch that closely, because people have changed their positions, Phyllis Schlafly, over time on substantive-based standards, and you should be aware of that and not take what's said today as necessarily what has always been a standard or principle. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it is. But I just want to say one thing. First of all, we did run a little bit over, so Andrew, if you could shorten yours so they get their time. Because you're on the pro side. Let me say, the number one rule we have is these are our guests, guys. And we're going to treat them as our guests. They come to share their knowledge on this with us, and we need to make sure we do that. So I would have come in earlier, except Todd seemed to hold his own. He seemed to hold his own on that. Go ahead, Representative Brennan.
Thank you very much. For those of you who are from out of the area, this is the district I represent in the Ohio House. I am the Vice Chairman of the Ohio House Education Committee, and I'm one of the conservative Republicans who rejected the $13 billion in Medicaid expansion. So, now, that being said, we're going to talk a little bit about Common Core. And I also listen to Glenn Beck pretty much every day, so I know where many of you are coming from. Ohio standards over the last 20 years were non-existent. Let me get down to this. The reason Common Core was implemented in Ohio, and I'm going to get into a little bit about what Ohio has done that's probably different than the state of Indiana, because quite honest, I think what we've done in Ohio is better than in Indiana. I think our governor got in trouble for that the other day too. But Common Core, I'm going to give you some numbers here. We, last year in the Ohio House, passed many bills, including improving the A through F grading system, because we need to know really where our kids stand. And under state indicators met under our urban districts, under the most recent simulation of the 8 major school districts in the state in the urban areas, 81% of them failed. Let me repeat that. 81% of them failed to meet the state indicators. The overall Common Core standards are just basically that. They're standards. They're nothing to be really worried about from the standpoint, okay, we're setting some basic standards that says, you know what, we're better than this. We expect more from our students. We expect more from our schools. And we expect more in general, because if we're going to compete, we can't compete when we're 28th on the planet in pretty much everything when it comes to our English, math, and so forth. So when we're taking a look at the Common Core itself is a Republican conservative idea. Now you can say, okay, Obama is taking over part of it and all that. That's fine, you can say that. But in Ohio here, we have 613 school districts. They set the curriculum by Ohio Revised Code. The state of Ohio doesn't. Each one of your school boards, which you elect, selects the curriculum. So if you want to hold anything accountable, you need to make sure you're electing school board members at the local level who are selecting that curriculum that doesn't give some sort of bias coming out from Washington and Obama. In Ohio last year, as part of this history, we had 2 bills. One was sponsored by John Adams. Great name, great Marine, or great Navy SEAL. We passed, and it was actually the Senate bill version of Senate Bill 165, the Founding Documents Bill. So, as part of the curriculum that we put underneath certain grade levels, they're going to have to teach the founding documents. The left, believe me, didn't like that. They hated it. But these are ways that you can say, okay, you're going to set high standards, but you're also going to say, okay, this is what you're also going to teach. And we in Ohio are doing that. Common Core includes only mathematics, English, language arts, and states may customize 15% of the other standards. Other content standards such as social studies, science, technology, art, etc. are Ohio specific. So we in Ohio set that, not the federal government. And believe me, if we can reject $13 billion in aid coming from Medicaid, we can probably reject education money as well. We are a local control state by statute, which means in Ohio, as opposed to some of the other states, the state doesn't tell the local districts specifically what the curriculum is. It's up to you in the local districts. No district in Ohio, by Ohio Revised Code, is required to adopt the Common Core or any state content standards, although districts are held responsible for the achievement test. Well, guess what? We want them to pass achievement tests so they know, basic algebra when they're at the appropriate level, when they know basic calculus and so forth. We need to have them pass those standards. Common Core is just the low tier, the way I see it. And actually, I slightly disagree here. I think Ohio is for pushing the standards higher beyond Common Core. And I think we are going to do it. Ohio has not finalized how student achievements will be assessed. In-course examinations, some are Ohio specific and some are through the PARC Testing Consortium, have been proposed for high school students. Common Core is part of an effort to raise student achievement standards. Nearly 30% of Ohio students drop out of school before earning a high school diploma. Let me repeat that. If you want to have an ignorant society that can be controlled by an Obama, let 30% of them drop out of school. 41% of Ohioans, and in this district, the school district that we're sitting in, which is one of the best in the state, 31% of them have to take remedial classes in college. 41% is the state average. So that means they're going through high school based on the low standards that we've had before. And I'm going to tell you, I think the teachers are trying to do their darndest. There's a couple of them in here today. I know them. I got a couple relatives of mine that are teachers. But when 41% end up in college and they have to take a remedial class, guess what? That costs you and I as taxpayers more money because they're taking the same class over again. So when you have very low to non-existent standards, that's the result. Common Core is not a condition of federal funding unless this local school district on a local basis decided to accept race to the top funding. So that is something that is made at the local level here in Ohio. So this is where you all need to double check your local school boards to see, okay, did they accept it and what kind of things are being implemented in your local districts, because it is the citizens' responsibility to do that, the way I see it. As was said, Common Core is a joint effort of the National Governors Association, the Council of Chief State Local Officers. Most of the governors were Republican governors that were basically conservative. Common Core began in 2007 when Ohio began reviewing and updating their mathematics standards. Since Ohio was ahead of the curve, much of the Common Core mathematics standards are based on Ohio's early version. In other words, we were actually ahead of the curve on this. There aren't high enough standards in my opinion. For instance, Minnesota, as you may have said, did adopt the English Language Arts Common Core standards, but not the mathematics standards because their review showed standards were more rigorous. And I think there were some issues going on in Minnesota there. The president likes Common Core. He also likes school choice. The teachers' unions don't like that. I'm a huge school choice proponent because guess what? It drives down costs and it adds, and especially in these horrible districts as far as results, adds competition. And we all know that the free market system works. There's other things. Michelle Rhee, I think, I've met her on a couple of occasions. Bottom line is, we shouldn't be afraid of the standards. And I don't think anybody in here should be afraid of the standards. I think the standards they're okay. They're better than what we have. But I think what you should be concerned about is maybe who at the top, at the federal level, is trying to dictate certain criteria when it comes to collecting data and so forth. I want to touch on that real quickly, because here in Ohio, even the state of Ohio doesn't collect the information on the individual student. They have to collect a number. because of the way the system is set up, which is what led, and I think many of you here in Ohio probably have read, the fact that I think the city of Columbus, and we had a little scandal when they were doctoring their books on attendance. Well, that happened because guess what? We don't know any of the individual students based on the way our system is set up, because we don't collect individual data on the individual students. Only that goes to, the only thing that goes to the state of Ohio is actually numbered data. So all you're getting at there is basically the data to have a general idea of what the school district is doing. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the best thing either, because then you don't have the accountability right down to the individual student. What I can say is that I think that we shouldn't be demonizing something just because that there are some issues at the federal level. We need to realize that we need to raise our standards here in Ohio, and this is a way to do it. But we also have to be vigilant about how we're handling our standards and making sure that the curriculum isn't taken over by a bunch of left-wing nut jobs who are going to try to dictate their curriculum on the rest of the society. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Representative Brenner. So that concludes the pro side, and now Jamie Gass is going to start on the anti side on the Common Core.
Thanks. So I'm going to stand up. I'm a little more comfortable that way. So my name is Jamie Gass. I'm director for the Center for School Reform at Pioneer Institute. It's a Boston-based think tank. We were one of the big drivers behind a lot of the successful reforms that Massachusetts enacted in the 1990s. I want to just give you a little bit of context to help sort of shape this discussion. So I'll start with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights and the founders were very clear about these things. Education, K-12 education in this country, is a state and local matter. It is a state and local matter for legal reasons and financial reasons. This is something that people in and around the public policy community have understood for decades. It's something that even Lyndon Johnson understood. He put into the elementary and secondary education law in 1965 that the federal government may not participate in the development of standards, tests, or curriculum. It's something that Jimmy Carter understood in 1979 when they established the U.S. Department of Education. He made it clear the federal government cannot participate in this in any way, shape, or form. In 1983, Ronald Reagan appointed a commission, and they created a report called The Nation at Risk. And what it told us was that the quality of K-12 education in this country was very poor in comparison to our international competitors in Japan, South Korea, and Singapore and Hong Kong. What he did not do, and what that commission did not do, is prescribe that the federal government in any way, shape, or form would be the ones that would be driving the reforms of K-12 education. He wisely, as the Republicans did in the 1990s did, actually had the opposite view, that the U.S. Department of Education was probably a hindrance to these kinds of policies, and that again, these are issues that are best dealt with at the state and local level. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about Massachusetts because that's where my experience is. So Massachusetts in 1993, Republicans and Democrats got together on a landmark education reform law. And what the deal was is that there'd be a great deal of additional funding that would be put into the system. And in the last 20 years, Massachusetts at the state and local level has spent about $100 billion. In exchange for that enormous investment of taxpayers' funds was all the hard things that people in K-12 education never wanted to do. So it was high stakes testing for graduation, high academic quality standards, charter schools, teacher testing. That was the grand bargain. And what were the sort of the central components of it? The central component of it was high academic standards. A lot of the people in the trade organizations in Washington, D.C., many of whom are back in the Common Core, have always preferred national standards to state level standards, and they have always preferred a workforce development model in K-12 education. And what we know over the last 20 years or so is that the states that have implemented that kind of workforce development, soft skills model have either flatlined or declined. What was unique about Massachusetts is we said, we are going to start at the basics. We are going to have our English standards are going to be constituted 90% in classic literature. So it's things like Huckleberry Finn, Moby Dick, Dickens, Shakespeare, etc. And you say, well, why does that really matter? Why does that matter to kids in their lives? It matters because the quality of vocabulary that children get in those kinds of books is way better than certainly anything you're going to get in workforce development, and it's way better than you're going to find anything in nonfiction. And the proof of that is that in conjunction with the success that we had in the math, where we had our children being prepared for Algebra 1, which is the gateway course for all higher level math by the 8th grade, that's what the standard was set in Massachusetts. We know that the two of those things together have led to historic gains for Massachusetts in the last 10 or 15 years. There's really two conversations in this country about education reform at the K-12 level. There's a lot of the things that the rest of the country has tried, and then there's what Massachusetts has done, and we know it works. Now, I'm not saying that to be excessively proud about my state. I'm just, even the proponents of Common Core would acknowledge that. Most of the states are aspiring to be, number one in the country for the last 4 administrations of the nation's report cards that tests, 4th and 8th grade in reading and math. Massachusetts, no state has ever done it once. Massachusetts did it 4 times in a row. We tested in 2007 as an individual country, as in Minnesota with very high math standards, and we were scored right up there with Hong Kong and Singapore and Japan, all the countries that back in the early 80s, Ronald Reagan's commission said that we need to compete with. Massachusetts is competing with them. That's the good news. The good news is that we have one model. We don't need Finland. We don't need, actually, at this point, to look at a lot of the international comparisons, because we have a model that's in this country. And we know that when the state-level policymakers pay for it, and when they set the standards and have control over it and have ownership over it, that it works. And everyone across the spectrum, whether you're for or against Common Core, they know that. Okay? That's the good news. The bad news is that in 2009 and 2010, a variety of trade organizations in Washington, D.C., the Governors Association, the Commissioners of Education, Achieving, the Thomas B. Fordham Foundation, folks that for 20 years or so all have wanted to have national standards. I mean, people can talk about Checker Finn and they can talk about the Fordham Institute, but the reality is if they're complaining that the quality of the standards are not good in Ohio, they have been in Ohio for 20 years. They've had the opportunity to provide the leadership, and they have not. If you look carefully at all of the proponents of Common Core, you will find that not one of them in one state, one district, one locality has actually improved student achievement anywhere in the last 20 or 25 years. So you have a contrast. We have a proven record in Massachusetts against a bunch of folks who have been hanging out in Washington, D.C. for 20 years and have wanted to have national standards and haven't been able to get it done. Okay? So we looked at the academic quality. We got the best researchers, independent researchers. We didn't take any funding from the government. We didn't take any money from the Gates Foundation, who paid for the development of standards. The Fordham Institute, their evaluations of the Common Core standards against other states was paid for by the Gates Foundation, the same people that developed the standards. I think that's called being judge and jury in your own case. What we did next, because there are significant legal issues here, people across the spectrum, left, right, center, have always known that there are these 3 federal laws that explicitly prohibit the federal government from advancing national standards testing curriculum. So what did we do? As we did on the standards side, we got the best people we could. We got a guy named Kent Talbert, who is the general counsel for the U.S. Department of Education under the second Bush administration. And we got the deputy general counsel, Bob Eitel, for the U.S. Department of Education. What did they do? They mapped out a policy paper for us. The title of it is called A Road to a National Curriculum. So while the proponents say this isn't going to lead to a national curriculum, the 2 lead lawyers in the U.S. Department of Education under the second Bush administration map out the 3 federal laws that explicitly prevent the federal government from doing it, and they say it's going to lead to a national curriculum. It was the title that they picked for the policy brief that we published. We are very pleased with the quality of the policy brief, but so is George Will, because about a year ago, George Will wrote a column about it. He wrote, the title of it was Those Pesky Little Thing Called Laws. And what the proponents of the national standards are not telling you is that while the chief state school officers are the ones that develop the standards, most of the states adopted the standards, not through their state legislatures. Most state legislatures never had a bill, they never had discussion, there was no debate. It was adopted through the commissioners of education and the boards of education. So they bypassed the elected officials in the democratically elected officials in each of the legislatures across the country. What they also will not admit is that the testing, the national testing, there are 2 testing consortia that have been paid $360 million explicitly by the federal government, violating federal law, to develop the PARCC test, which is what you'll have here in Ohio. So if you have the standards that are in place and that states adopted through this race to the top that was promoted by the federal government, and you have the tests, the only thing that sits in the middle is the curriculum, what's taught in the class. And again, we had the 2 lead lawyers from the U.S. Department of Education saying that's what this is all about. This is about having a national curriculum. So you'd think that given the fact that this is going to impact 40 or 50 million school children, that the proponents of national standards would actually tell everyone what it's going to cost, right? They would have done a cost analysis, sure, right? They didn't. Pioneer Institute, same thing. We're independent researchers. What we did is we enlisted the best researchers we could find to look at the cost. And what we found from this research is going to cost states and localities. Again, you're going to pay for 90% of this. There isn't going to be anyone from the federal government that's going to save the day on this. You're going to pay for 90% of it, so you should know what it's going to cost. It's going to cost Ohio, in our calculation, about $600 million. And across the country, it's going to cost the states and localities $16 billion. So this is one of those things where we all know that when the federal government gets involved with things, it doesn't tend to be on the low end. We actually think that this is a moderate calculation of what's going to cost. And finally, before I wrap up, Pioneer Institute, first and foremost, an advocate of school choice. We think that parents and grandparents and families are the ones that should be dictating where their kids go, and choosing where their kids go. And the thing that we have sort of the gravest concern about is that national standards are being adopted also through voucher programs, which we're in favor of in places like Indiana and Florida and elsewhere, so that parochial schools that receive vouchers have to adopt the national standards and the national test also. So there's, the reality of it is that the proponents of this, they're creating a structure where there's not really an escape from it. That's what their goal is to make sure that no kid goes through a system that doesn't go to this approach. And it will, again, Common Core has lower quality, it is illegal, and it is prohibitively expensive. And I think these are the kinds of things that you need to know and you need to ask your public officials about, because it will have a profound impact on your children. Thanks.
Well, thank you for inviting me here today. Again, my name is Heather Crossan. I'm a wife, a mother of 4 children, and a stay-at-home mother. And I recently became engaged. Really, my involvement goes back to the early 90s. At that time, I was a congressional staffer, both in Washington, D.C. and back in my district office in Indiana. And that was when really the debate about national standards began. And I would maintain that this is nothing new. And for those of you who were not around, it started with America 2000, then it was Goals 2000, then we had No Child Left Behind, and Race to the Top is really the final nail in the coffin. But I would maintain a great number of Republicans, in fact, every Republican in the House and Senate voted against Goals 2000, which was the last time there was really an attempt at a federal takeover of education during the Clinton years. So I would say that really we are picking up where we left off. There was a great deal of backlash then. Outcome-based education was the big buzzword of the day. And so I would say really what it boils down to is many of the same people have been saying the same things for years. We have a problem and we have a solution. We're going to take local control away bit by bit by bit. But saying that, I, in about 97, retired, and I went, got married, had a family, had children of my own, and was pretty much minding my own business until a year ago this past fall. And that was when my children, who are at a Catholic parochial school, came home with some new math. The math that started coming home is what we're calling fuzzy math. And for those of you not familiar, it's really kind of a remake of the new math that was around in the 60s that was tried and thrown out as a failure. But if you're not familiar with what it is, I'll just give you a short explanation. The worksheets that started coming home were odd. They weren't familiar to us. They didn't have a lot of arithmetic on them. They had 3 or 4 problems, and A lot of it was you had to solve problems in odd, roundabout ways. To give you an example, adding 3-digit numbers. Well, instead of using the standard algorithm where you stack the numbers up, begin in the ones column, carry, students are instructed to break the numbers apart. So 312 plus 416. Well, the child's supposed to know, well, you start in the hundreds column and you break the numbers apart. You say 312 is 300 plus 10 plus 2, and 416 is 400 plus 10 plus 6. So then I go back and I add the hundreds column first, 300 plus 400, then I add the tens, then I add the ones, then I take all of those, and then I add all of those together, and that's how I get my answer. That seemed odd to us. Because then when we did go back, belatedly, after our children were taught all these different methods, and we said, well, really, you should just use the standard algorithm. It's the fastest, most efficient way. Our children all wanted to start in the hundreds column. So that was a problem. And the other things we noticed is that there was a shocking little amount of practice in basic arithmetic, and then instead there was a great deal of time spent on explaining how you got your answers. But they wanted very scripted explanations. So I like to give the bridge problem my third grader brought home, and I forgot to bring it with me, but it went something like this. Bridge A is 487 feet long, and bridge B is 212 feet long. Which bridge is longer? How do you know? Explain your answer. Well, my daughter wrote, bridge A is longer. I got my answer by just looking at the numbers and comparing. And seeing that 487 is greater than 412. Now, as an adult, I thought that looked like a pretty good answer. To me, greater than is a mathematical term in my book. Wrong. My daughter got that answer wrong. She actually got it mostly wrong. She got 1 point out of 3. The scripted answer that they were looking for was, I compared the add-ins in the hundreds column and saw that 4 was greater than 2. Then I compared the add-ins in the tens column. Then I compared the add-ins in the ones column. So this math caused, kind of a stir in our community, and so we, went to the principal, who quickly decided he better call in the sales lady for the publishing company that sold us the textbook. And she came and she gave us these nice sample copies, and she proceeded to tell us how lucky we were because we had adopted one of the very first Common Core aligned textbooks in the country. And the really telling thing is that when the parents weren't buying it, what she was selling, our principal finally, in frustration, said, look, I know parents don't like this type of math because it's not the way any of us were taught math, but we have to teach it this way because this is how it's going to be on the new PARCC assessment. And, that was the first I had heard that Indiana had adopted a set of standards known as the Common Core, and that our test was being replaced with a federally funded test known as the PARCC that was to be given 4 times a year on the computer, so it was really intended to drive what is taught in the classroom, much more so than, once a year test in the spring. So I was shocked because I had followed this so closely for almost 10 years, in the early 90s. I was shocked that this had happened, and I had no idea, and I assumed that perhaps it had been reported in our papers. So I began asking around. I called a former reporter of 22 years who had retired and gone on to teaching at a private K-8 school in Indianapolis. I thought for certainly she would know, when Indiana had adopted the Common Core. And I contacted her and I said, Andrea, when did Indiana adopt the Common Core? And her response to me was, I have no idea. Last I heard, Indiana had pretty good standards. So I contacted my state senator who sits on the Senate Education Committee, thinking he would be able to bring me up to speed. He virtually knew nothing about it. I continued to ask other politicians. Basically, no one knew anything about it. So my friend and I began doing a little bit of research because what we saw, and the more research we didn't like it. We looked at the meeting minutes when our unelected State Board of Education adopted the Common Core, and frankly, we were shocked. There was no research, there was no evidence. We expected to see studies and reports about comparing Indiana's old standards. Particularly, you mentioned the Fordham Report. The Fordham Report, which has been noted, it's a pro-Common Core foundation, and it was funded by, the study was funded with funding from the Gates Foundation. Your report even gave gave Indiana solid A's. In fact, our English standards were rated as clearly superior. And our math standards were given a higher rating as well. And so we thought maybe that would have been an important study to have shown our State Board of Education members, but no, it was not. It was basically a sales pitch, the same sales pitch and slogans that really, I believe, have been used almost all around the country, which is, your old standards were a mile wide and an inch deep. These are fewer, clearer, deeper. You know, and when it came to Indiana, the reality was the Fordham Institute had said actually ours were clearer, ours were more rigorous, you know, and actually ours are fewer. Our math standards, our content standards are fewer than those of the Common Core. So even those slogans that didn't work in Indiana is how it was sold. And regarding deeper, I've seen deeper. And with I have 2 children now, you know, we adopted K through 5, this new Envision Math, which is Common Core aligned. So I've now seen the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and almost all of the 4th grade curriculum. And I can promise you, it is going at a much slower pace. Hands down. I have every paper they've ever brought home, and I can show you it is not high internationally benchmarked standards that we were promised. I'd also like to add that, you know, some of the research we did, which can you know, be talked about in the Q&A, but we were surprised when we looked into it, because what we found is the problems we saw coming home were starting to be written about by some of the people that served on the validation committee. We obtained testimony from James Milgram, the only mathematician, the only content expert on the validation committee who refused to sign off, who said, you know, it'll put our students behind, you know, in mathematics 2 years by the end of 8th grade. And that's why he was not willing to sign off on it. And again, Sandra Stotsky, we read what she had to say. She and 4 other members of the English Language Arts Validation Committee refused to sign off as well. And her estimation, she said the literacy level for a college diploma will be at about a 7th grade level. You know, so that troubled us. And I'd just like to end by saying that I'm really happy everyone's here, because what we found out in the last year that we've been talking about this in Indiana is that a debate was sorely missing. In most states there was no debate, and the conversation we're having now I think is necessary and healthy, because it didn't happen the first time around. I'd like to end by reading to you, you know, a quote that Dr. Anthony Esselon said when it comes to this shift from classical and creative literature in English classes to more informational text. I think he has an important message, and he can say it better than I, but it really is the essence of what bothers me as a parent about that shift. He says, what appalls me most about the standards is the cavalier contempt for great works of human art and thought in literary form. It is the sheer ignorance of the life of the imagination. We are not programming machines. We are teaching children. We are not producing functionaries, factory-like. We are to be forming the minds and hearts of men and women. Frankly, I do not wish to be governed by people whose minds and hearts have been stunted by a strictly utilitarian miseducation. Do not train them to become apparatchiks in a vast political and economic system, but raise them to be human beings, honoring what is good and right, cherishing what is beautiful, and pledging themselves to their families, their communities, their churches, and their countries. And you know, that's what I want for my children. But sadly, what I want no longer matters, because as we found out the hard way with the math standards, the control and really who makes the decision about what occurs in the child's classroom, is it the parents and teachers in the local community, or is it unelected bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., unaccountable to the electorate? I think that's really what's at stake here, and I really think that that's really what it all boils down to, is who controls what is taught.
Thanks, Heather. My name is Joy Pullman. I work for the Heartland Institute. I run their education department. And the Heartland Institute is a state-focused think tank. And the tagline I like to use is one of our mottos, which is that we focus on researching and promoting the policies that empower individuals. So I'm also a mother of 3 children, so for me this is also a personal issue, and I care a lot about education as anyone who would in a country where we're self-governing people, supposedly, and we have to have the knowledge and the ability to govern ourselves, and that's why education is important to our governance and our ability to function as a society. So I'd like to roll off of what my colleagues have been saying and just go right on to what Heather was talking about, a centralized system of education. So we can talk back and forth about federal influence on Common Core. Because we all know that the federal government is the only one funding these national tests that are coming along with Common Core. Not only that, the federal government has just appointed a review panel that one of Emmy's colleagues is sitting on to review the exact test questions, the test format, so on and so forth, which, as Jamie mentioned, is entirely illegal for the government to be intruding into curriculum. And our esteemed opponents, who have a lot of good things to say, keep saying, Common Core is not a curriculum. But if it encounters, changes all the textbooks in the country, which it is, if it changes the teacher preparation, which all the Common Core folks say it does, if it changes the way that teachers are going to be evaluated and therefore hired and fired and promoted and so forth, this is, and the testing, which, and of course, how students perform on tests determines, and among other things, depending on the state that they're funding, whether the state will sanction and so on and so forth. This is a total, absorbent system. It's not just some list of goals and aspirations, but it has some teeth in it, and the teeth are the tests that the federal government is the only one funding and controlling right now. So we can talk about that for things in a second, but I wanted to talk about the ideas of why even a centralized program, if we're talking about Common Core, is run by a bunch of bureaucrats from the National Governors Association and Chief Council of State School Officers.
Excuse me for 1 minute. Could Mr. Jones please refrain from tapping, because we're doing a
Sorry about that. I wasn't aware that it was being very long.
So I'm going to talk about the dangers of a centralized system and why that presents problems for creating the excellence that all of us on the stage really want to have and have for our children. We get the debatability of the federal control. We'll leave that aside and just talk about it as obviously a centralized national way of looking at and administering education. So you applauded earlier, to talk to the idea of organizing education around a free market, competition, individual choice, and so forth. Well, of course, central planning is the exact opposite of a free market. And Nobel Prize-winning economist Friedrich Hayek had some insightful observations about central planning. So let me read you 2 from The Road to Serfdom. He says, by uniting in the hands of some single body, power formerly exercised independently by many, an amount of power is created infinitely greater than any that existed before, so much more far-reaching that is almost to be different in kind. So when you take the ability to determine, I'll actually also address the idea that local control. Districts can choose any curriculum they want as long as it's Common Core and all their kids take the Common Core tests. So you take the power and you put it into some body that you cannot control, that parents and districts can't even go to and say, look, this doesn't work for us, we want it changed. And you're heightening the power, you're making the power stronger. And then Hayek goes on to talk about what that actually does, as it leads to. He says central planning leads to dictatorship because dictatorship is the most effective means of coercion, and as such, it's essential if central planning on a large scale is to be possible. So of course, coercion, the tests. You have to enforce Common Core through all the tests, and that's why I have to tie it to teacher evaluations and their pay and so on and so forth. And I support testing, but I don't support using standards as a stick to enforce a centrally determined curriculum on families and children. So Hayek also said that the more governments plan, the less individuals can. So in short, what we see with Common Core is a massive distrust of teachers and elected education officials such as local school boards. The goal is to do more central planning so that parents in schools, who obviously are failures so far, can do less individual and local planning. The problem with this, of course, that it's entirely impossible for central planning, as Hayek pointed out, and he called this the information problem. Central planners can't know what parents and teachers do about the individual children in their care. It's entirely impossible for them to be able to know everything about the 3.2 million children in the country who need individualized attention, and that the parents and teachers who are with them every day understand. So what this does is pushes education more towards a factory model where children are treated as units and widgets compared against standardized checklists. So this is inhumane and it destroys education itself. So I'm going to talk about how Common Core central planning hurts education diversity and reduces education freedom, and the frightening data tracking embedded in the project. So the first idea is that Common Core reduces choice and reduces diversity in schools. The first thing that Common Core ignores is that there's a legitimate diversity of views about how and what children should learn. The Common Core proponents ignore this and assume that not just one size fits everyone, but that it is morally right to impose their vision of education on the entire country with very little debate beforehand. School choice under Common Core becomes letting parents decide what form of education, homeschooling, private schooling, public schooling, charter schools, will best implement the centrally determined education content. So as Greg Forster, the senior fellow with the Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice says, you can choose which McDonald's franchise you frequent so that they can compete to make you the best Big Mac, but you're out of luck if you prefer pizza. So I also want to talk about the idea of low standards, just interjecting your idea that actually the large reason that many states have extremely poor standards is the federal government's fault in the first place. Because the federal government, in under No Child Left Behind, said to states, we're going to give you money and sanctions according to whether your kids rate proficient on tests and standards that you determine. So of course states had a very strong incentive to say, all our kids are proficient, we can get all our money, don't mess with us. So that actually has to be dealt with when people talk about the low standards that Ohio and other states have as well. So let's also, Common Core creates a giant game of telephone, so it's no wonder teachers are in utter confusion about what the standards mean for them in the classrooms. They're racing chunks of literature and throwing random technology into classes, although the standards don't necessarily require any of that. This is what happens with all centralized plans. It's impossible for information to travel from Common Core Central all the way down to 3.2 million teachers and 50 million school kids without misunderstanding and chaos. So here's the third and last danger of centralization. Handing a national organization the power to impose their education designs on all children creates a power center that special interests will and can bend all their effort towards capturing. Let's move on to talking about the data systems embedded in Common Core. This is one of my favorite pieces of information because it is freaky. So here's a quote from Dr. Green, who's head of the University of Arkansas Education Department. He said, the success of Common Core depends on building a centralized machine of assessment and consequences linked to the national standards. And we all know, this is a quote from both President Obama and U.S. Education Secretary R.D. Duncan. Several times they've said they want a cradle-to-career data system tracking kids, and they actually made good on this wish in the 2009 stimulus bill. To get general stimulus money, so this is not the race to the top, this is every single state, signed an agreement with the U.S. government, that this includes Ohio, that they would create a longitudinal student tracking database that must be shareable to other states and the federal government and other different agencies, not education, so labor, juvenile justice, and so forth, and include student-level data. So we have the representative here talking about Ohio doesn't do that, we do random numbers. Well, statutorily the state agreed that they would have student-level data, no more random, no more, this is just a pile of data, but this is, John Jones at 123 elementary, so on and so forth. And these databases are supposed to expand every kid's academic records into a comprehensive personal record, including social services, criminal justice, healthcare history, disciplinary record, family income range, family religion, family voting status, and test scores. According to both a 2012 Pioneer Institute report, and I looked this up, the original Department of Education statistics list of what these databases could be compiling about everyone's kids. So other information states could track through these databases include blood type, hobbies, nicknames, social security numbers, finger and eye prints. So if your kids, they go to school, they scan their hands. Some schools are scanning hands and eyes for school lunch. That your school has that biometric information that can go right into their little database. So this is also a huge hacking concern because child identity theft is a prime target for hackers because children don't find out about hacking a lot of times until they become adults and they think, wow, I have 4,000 credit cards that are all due in my name. So the second thing that the federal government did that is frightening regarding this is that they rewrote federal privacy laws, it's called FERPA, so that the federal government or any state or local education agency can share all your information in your child's file with anyone they want. Volunteer, company, different government agencies, police, without parent knowledge or consent. Some privacy law that. Through Race to the Top and Park Common Core tests, which Ohio is a member of, the federal government has told states which laws they must have. Each state had to demonstrate its, quote, commitment to and plan for identifying any existing barriers in state law, statute, regulation, or policy to implementing the proposed assessment system and to addressing any such barriers prior to full implementation. That's a quote from the memorandum that the state signed. This agreement also requires schools to collect information on students who are not tested, such as homeschool students and special needs students. We know that Oklahoma and New York are at least 2 states where they're adding some homeschool students to their federal accessible databases. So I'm just going to close here with a quote from a clinical psychologist, Dr. Gary Thompson. He's a self-described liberal. He calls himself an expert in cognitive and psychological testing, where he says, this is extremely highly personal information, and medical professionals consider it unethical for them to ever share any of this information without a court order, and sometimes even have to fight court orders because of how deep into your mind the tests can get nowadays. They're so accurate. He says, these same tests used in our clinic are used in part by federal law enforcement agencies, the military, local police departments, and the CIA. And placed in the wrong hands, psychological testing can ruin lives as well as cause psychological trauma to people if they have knowledge that their results were used for nefarious purposes. So he has reviewed the documents, the Common Core, state standards documents, the federal regulations related to that, and the data tracking, and he says it's entirely unprecedented. And although he supports public schools, he's not going to put his toddler into them until he sees these issues resolved to his satisfaction. This is why, I'll return to Hayek, the ultimate decisions about children need to be made by their families and their local communities and not sent.
I'm just so impressed, really, with all of our guests today. I want to thank you all for that. So now we go to Kenneth takes the stage, so now into the storm stage. But the pro side is 15 minutes, and you guys get to decide how to split that up. You want to arm wrestle for it, or 5 minutes? What, you want to do 5 minutes? I'm going to hold your time this time. Everybody went over. You're all bad.
Okay, I'm ceding time to Todd and Andy. 2 points I want to make, and to Heather, I wish we were in Indiana. I probably would be sitting here if we were in Indiana, because it would be less of a concern to me about the standards that my son the instruction he's receiving in his schools. My colleague Mike Petrelli testified to your Senate Education Committee a few months ago and said that exactly. You're in a unique spot, but we're in Ohio and our standards suck and they need to be improved. And that's why I'm here today, and that's why as a Republican, I am siding with this Common Core. So I want to point that out. I'd also say that the Common Core standards were well debated in Ohio. In October of 2009, our state superintendent indicated that we weren't adopting them. The state board wasn't interested. There was about an 8 or 9 month debate, a lot of newspaper coverage, a lot of real struggle on the part of the State Board of Education, which, remember, at that point in time was half Strickland's board. And they still really struggled mightily with the decision. Okay, they struggled mightily with the decision to adopt these standards. So I know that a lot of folks didn't realize what they were and the implications until later, but they were debated and heard, and public officials really took to heart what they were doing.
A few things here. First of all, it was said earlier that I guess the comparison and the discussion was Massachusetts standards. Over the last 10 years, Massachusetts raised their standards. We left ours stagnant. When the park, regarding whether or not you're going to have the curriculum and the standards are tied together, well, here in Ohio, as opposed to some of these other states, Ohio has adopted college readiness standards based on the SAT and ACT scores. So these other standards, the specific testing on park and stuff is irrelevant. It's also worth noting that Ohio law allows students to substitute other tests, so we in Ohio can have that choice. Some of these other states don't. I'm going to read to you also here, because first of all, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I heard Glenn Beck the other day talking about this and how, you know, he's behind pushing all this. Well, he's also behind school choice. So, you know, he's donated to some of the school choice stuff. Common Core state standards. And this is under trigonomic functions. Understand the radian measure of an angle is the length of the arc on the unit circle subtended by the angle. Explain how the unit circle of the coordinate plane enables the extension of the trigonomic functions of all real numbers interpreted into radian measures of angles traversed counterclockwise around the unit circle. Choose trigonomic functions to model periodic phenomena at a specified amplitude, frequency, and midline. And these are the standards for our high schools, because we didn't have any before. These are the actual Common Core. You can download them right from the website. This is on modeling functions. Create equations and inequities in a variable and use them to solve problems. Include equations arising from linear and quadratic equations and simple rational and exponential functions. Create equations of two or more variables to represent relationships between quantities. Graph equations and coordinate axes with labels and scales. And you can go on and on and on through here. And if anybody reads these, you're going to say, well, hey, this seems to be reasonable. And I think if you go to there, you're going to say these are reasonable base requirements, which we didn't have before here in Ohio. I'll tell you also, I passed a bill last year called House Bill 96. It's called a dyslexia bill. This gets down to curriculum. And the fact that if you have a particular university, and I won't mention it, although they've got a very good football team here in Columbus, adopted a whole language method, which most of the schools put into their curriculum, and it actually went nationally. Problem is, if you have dyslexia, and about 10 to 20% of the students in the United States do, you need phonics to be able to learn how to read, or the Orton-Gillingham method. So we had to put in our own code here in Ohio a requirement that, hey, dyslexia is recognized, and you guys need to start teaching these other kids, you know, not one size fits all. And with digital technology and with the changes that have occurred over the last 10 to 15 years, we could have probably individualized curriculum for every single student in the state of Ohio. Now, to some of the teachers, that's going to be a little tougher because you still have to grade them and you still have to take tests. A couple other things. The practical application to verify what works. Okay, let's say we don't have any kind of state standards and you don't, you know, test for them. Then how do you know the taxpayers' dollars are being held accountable? How do you know that those local schools are doing their job and that your kids, when they graduate and have an actual diploma, it actually means anything? We already are having this debate in colleges because many of us, and Kasich, our governor, has done a great job of pushing this. We got a lot of students graduating from college with degrees that aren't going to do anything to help them get a job and actually earn a living. Well, we're trying to do the same thing here in high schools and in our elementaries and middle schools. We're trying to raise the standards and raise the bar. Because if you don't raise the bar and you don't have accountability, guess what? You have, as I pointed out earlier, 81% of the students in the urban districts failing to meet the proficiency requirements, which means that 81% received an F. That's going to drag down everybody, and it has been dragging down everybody because we've set our standards so low, they don't mean anything. Now, I'm getting back to the fact that the curriculum itself is the issue. And where, you know, Glenn Beck and company, and I'm in agreement. We need to be on top of our curriculum, and we need to be on top of it locally. But here in Ohio, it's up to the local school boards. It is not, yes it is. And if your local school boards aren't doing their jobs, then I suggest you vote them out of office. The issue here is that the school boards, and I've sat in on these meetings, because I do sit on the House Education Committee, I do meet with many school board members. Some of them do their jobs. And I'm going to tell you, I think the teachers are trying to adapt to whatever is adapted. And so then a lot of times the teachers get blamed. Well, they're just doing what they are told by their school boards and whatever the criteria is that's coming down either from the state or the federal level. So when you're going to your local school boards and you're talking to them about this, you're saying, okay, what are you adopting? What is the curriculum? What are in the textbooks? That's up to you as the voters and as the individual taxpayers. You need to be holding them accountable, and if they're not, vote them out. Same thing here, and I had another point, I'm drawing a blank on it. Apples to apple comparisons. I think that's really one of the main reasons why George W. Bush and Race to the Top and all this stuff came about. You don't have an apple-to-apple comparison in the United States, between counties, between local jurisdictions. I can't tell whether or not a student graduating from Cleveland Heights is comparable with their education to a student graduating in this school district here, Olentangy. Now I'm going to tell you this, a student graduating from Olentangy is going to most likely go on and actually get a degree and earn a decent living and raise a family that isn't going to be stuck in poverty and isn't going to have a bunch of problems. So, you know, you can be upset at the overall standards, but we need to continue raising, we need to hold our local elected officials accountable to make sure that they're doing their job. So, I've got a couple other points and I'll remember them probably in a bit.
I'll just reaffirm one of the things that the representative said. If you don't like the curriculum in your local schools, fire your school board. And in fact, that's how it's conducted. In my district, I live in New Albany, we didn't like how things were being handled. We had a superintendent backed by the board. The board got fired. The new board fired the superintendent. We have a new superintendent. We have a better system. That's how local accountability works in Ohio. I'll tie that back with a little bit of what I've seen of what Common Core means for changing the curriculum. The curriculum in math in my district, which is a reasonably high-performing district, has been shifted down to be tougher. What was 8th grade is now 7, what was 9 is now 8, to comply with the new standards to make sure that we're able to reach those standards in time by the time the students get to 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade. That's what it required. Ohio is not Indiana. Ohio is not Texas. It is not Virginia or Maryland. It is not South Carolina or Massachusetts. States where the standards are better. We are Ohio. We have to move forward in terms of the strength of our standards. And I assure you, if I were in those states, and I used to live in Virginia, it would be a different standard, but I don't. I live in Ohio, and we have to move the ball forward. It's been a little interesting for me for all the talk of Hayek. You know, Friedrich Hayek was actually my Facebook logo for 3 years till my son said, "Who is that man?" And that's not you. You're not that old looking yet. But it is a straw man to set up that the implication of what is going on is necessarily the road to serfdom as implied. The fact that there are some areas I'm going to get to of agreement with what they've said, but it requires activism by you. In fact, I'll start with those now. One of them is data systems. I've known Ken Talbot for 20 years. In fact, the base research he did for that book, or that report, is something he and I, as one of the 3 lawyers on the House Education Committee, did 20 years ago. And that is, what is the federal authority to implement education laws? At a time when we were contemplating closing the Department of Education. I'm one of the guys that did that legal research for the Republican members of Congress at the time. And so I know that material intimately. And the fact is, we also looked at curriculum. There's actually a specific prohibition that's been in the House Appropriations Bill since the 1970s, explicitly stating that money shall not be used to develop curriculum. That has been in law and reenacted every year since the 1970s. I want to assure you what is going on right now with a Republican-controlled House is not permitting that to occur. Now you can say it's leading to the creation of curriculum. When you give money to people to create curricula, you are not creating the curricula yourself. The people you pay to do it are doing that. If you doubt me on this, let's go back to the reading research, which was federally funded, that frankly turned the tide on the whole language movement. I was there for that too. Back in the late 80s and through the 90s, the National Institutes of Health developed the research necessary to demonstrate that systematic phonemic awareness and the use of phonics is what led to children having lower rates of need for services because they're learning disabled. It turned the tide of the debate. Reed Lyon, who led that center, it was done with federal funds. I'll remind you of that. And in fact, the implication of that research was then taken to create curriculum using federal funds for test subjects, for test programs, that led to ultimately it being turned the tide in most states. And I will assure you, in the state of Ohio, that tide has not turned. And there are some colleges that still continue to robustly reject those. You can find one of those colleges on North High Street. But that's a local issue that you, as elected Ohioans, need to address. It's not something that's being imposed on us by the federal government. By the way, on the data system, I too share the concern about data systems. Kent and I, when we were in the department, I was deputy secretary. Now, it wasn't called that because that sounds stupid, but effectively my title is the #2 guy in the #2 office. And we were part of the work that, the debate over whether to loosen FERPA laws, that's the federal privacy laws, for purposes of research. Kent and I lost that debate internally, and Margaret Spellings loosened them. The Obama administration in 2011 significantly loosened them and did so through the change in the regulations. And where was the American public on this? Nobody said anything. Now everyone can say, I haven't heard about it, this is what I know now. Folks, this is the reality of public life now. Things go on. If you're interested in them, you need to be paying attention. I'm on the side of that too. I lost that debate. I wrote one of the more stinging commentaries on that out there, but the Obama administration rolled it. And the sad fact is, folks, elections have consequences. Now, this may not have been the only point that you voted. My candidate preference didn't get to be elected president, but the reality is the law is what it is because of who got elected. And I'll remind you how Ohio voted this last election, okay? Just as a reminder. Let me talk about a couple of last things, and then I'll run out of time. First off, cost estimates. Cost estimates compared to what? Let me remind you of a couple things. First off, if we don't improve the education of people in this state, we're going to continue to have a large subpopulation of low-educated, low-employed people, and I assure you that the welfare state as it exists in America will not be changed by the time I retire. In some way, somehow, you're going to get to pay for it. You're going to get to pay through it, through higher crime, higher insurance, and direct taxation otherwise. And you need to be focused on how do we raise the education attainment level of the kids in those schools. That's who we need to focus on. Parochial schools must adopt. To that I will dissent. To require that to be a condition of receiving state aid has to go through one of two places. The place he works or the board I serve on. And I assure you, as one of the leading members of the working majority on the State Board of Education, that isn't happening on my watch. I'm reasonably certain the State Board President will say that as well. She's at the back of the room. And lastly, let me finish on, a lot of confusion here goes into the assertion that what is required in curriculum is being driven by Common Core. And I hear this all the time from people saying, well, we have to do this because of Common Core. And a minute ago, I told you my principal, my superintendent said, we're doing this because of Common Core. To that extent, she was right. She realized we had to raise the standards, and she and her team chose the curriculum. The curriculum is not driven by Common Core. We have terrible school districts in this state. We have great school districts in this state. They differ in how they deliver education. How would that be possible if we didn't have local curriculum control? And I want to assure you, there is no way in the world that adoption of state standards, just because they're also adopted in other states, somehow turns it into a nationally controlled standard where you can't control local curriculum anymore. And if you don't believe me, just try and change your local curriculum. If you're on school boards, direct your superintendent to do it and watch when nothing happens from the state level. Thank you.
I just, to follow up real quickly, we had a discussion also that it was pointed out that, collection of data and certain things. We have something called the EMA system here in Ohio. It's called the Educational Management Information System. Things that are not collected on it are health information, family income, religious affiliation. Those things are not collected in it. In fact, the system is so old and antiquated and out of date, our local school districts can't get the data back to be able to figure out what they need to do with the schools until the following school year. Well, at that point, the data is already out of date and it's worthless to them for the most part anyway. So that is not happening here in Ohio, and it won't happen pretty much as long as I'm in the education committee.
Okay. There we go. I want to just read a quick quote. First off, in 2009, in explaining the Common Core Race to the Top strategy, Bill Gates said in a speech to the National Council of State Legislators, he said, when the tests are aligned with the common standards, the curriculum will line up as well. That's basically what Joy Pullman said. At the heart of this discussion, I think we recognize that what's going on in our country is a certain battle. Now, it's true, some Republicans lined up and supported the Common Core, very prominent ones like Jeb Bush and Mitch Daniels and Tony Bennett, and it would not have swept across the country without their assistance. But the battle that's going on is whether Americans can exercise their God-given right to direct their government and raise their children. On that note, in rejecting the Common Core, Texas Governor Rick Perry said, "It would be foolish and irresponsible to put our children's future in the hands of unelected bureaucrats and special interest groups thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., virtually eliminating their parents from their children's education." Yesterday, the Republican National Committee passed a resolution, essentially by its state committee members, its kind of board of directors. And I'll read you excerpts from that resolution. Whereas the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers are two private membership organizations and receive tens of millions of dollars from private third parties to advocate for and develop the Common Core State Standards strategy, subsequently created the Common Core State Standards through a process that was not subject to any Freedom of Information Acts or other sunshine laws, and never piloted the Common Core State Standards. Resolved, I'm skipping some material obviously, resolved, the Republican National Committee recognizes the CCSS for what it is, an inappropriate overreach to standardize and control the education of our children so they will conform to a preconceived normal. And be it further resolved that the Republican National Committee rejects the collection of personal data for any non-educational purpose without the prior written consent of an adult student or a child student's parent, and that it rejects the sharing of such personal data without the prior written consent of an adult student or a child student's parent with any person or entity other than schools or education agencies within the state. And basically goes on to condemn the Common Core State Standards. And with regard to the issue that we, the people, need to be more engaged, well, I think that needs to be put in context. And that context is how this was pushed down on the people. It was pushed down in a way that was designed to evade the Constitution and one of the premises of the Constitution, and that's that the people and their elected legislators would have notice and an opportunity to study things and discuss them before they get implemented into policy and law. And I just want to step through just a few steps of that. So this idea of national standards was around for a while. 2006, 2007, it was being kept alive by among others, the Hunt Institute in North Carolina. They reached out to the Gates Foundation and brought them on board with the effort. The Gates Foundation started funding the National Governors Association and Council of Chief State School Officers on the effort, and prior to 2009 had spent in the realm of about $35 million. This was not for standards development, this was for strategy, developing strategies and set the groundwork for implementation. And it's important to note that through 2008, the governors themselves had not voted on this, but even if they had, the National Governors Association, as the resolution indicates, is a private trade organization. It has no grant of authority from the states. In other words, it has no grant of authority from the people. So this isn't state-led. So they developed this plan, and it's laid out in a document they published called Benchmarking for Success. They convinced the incoming Obama administration to adopt this plan. So this wasn't a hijack of an effort. This was a partnership. And then the Obama administration got it embedded in the 2009 stimulus bill, a $4.35 billion grant. About a week after the stimulus bill was used, it was a $4.35 billion that gave the department a lot of discretion on how to spend it. So a week later, C-SPAN asked Donnie Duncan, well, what are you going to do with this money? And he said, well, I really like the work of the National Governors Association and Gates in working to bring about national standards. And he said he wanted to be the catalyst to make that happen. And then, then he hired two top-level officials from the Gates Foundation, including someone in his Office of Innovation and Improvement, the director of that, and his chief of staff. So then the race to the top was announced. The National Governors Association finally took a vote, and you read the press description of the vote. It said it was a cursory vote, very little discussion. And as I said, once again, though, we don't know who the governors were that were there, but there was no debate anyway, and we don't even have that resolution. But by that time, the administration had already signaled that it favored what the National Governors Association was doing. It favored it in relation to the race to the top money. So the states at this time were under a lot of fiscal pressure. They were told by the administration, you better get this stimulus money, you better get as much of it as possible, or you're going to have to lay off hundreds of thousands of teachers. The administration announced the program, trying to do this very quickly. The first round of applications were due in January 2010. Now in the applications, the states had to commit to the Common Core. Well, one slight problem, the standards hadn't been written yet. This program fell under a constitutional principle called, well, you have to pass it before you find out what's in it. Pardon me? The total rebuttal is 15 minutes. I'm not sure you take that. You're limited. You're at 8.5. Okay, I'll finish this in a minute in deference to my colleagues. In March 2010, the first draft of the Common Core came out. June 1, 2010, the second round of Race to the Top applications were due, in which more states committed to the Common Core. June 2nd, 2010, the final draft of the Common Core was released. And then the states had 2 months in which to fulfill their commitments by formally adopting the standards, which means they had to sit down, evaluate the Common Core, compare them to their old standards, pilot study the Common Core, because no one else had done that, and no one else ever did it. Look at the evidence on which they were based, and I'm trying to think what else would need to be done. Perhaps give notice to the legislature, the people's representatives, since this was being marketed as transforming the education of every child in America. And what else? Perhaps give notice to the people themselves. All that had to be done between June and August 2nd, 2010. So that gets to the point of, well, why are people just now discussing this? The constitutional construct, the idea of a compound republic, of federal government and state governments, is meant to protect the engagement of the people, the discussion of the people. It's meant to preserve the idea of self-directed government. It's not meant to evade it, which is what was done in this case.
Totally curious, because it's been mentioned that it was well debated and publicly very well known. It was publicized in the papers. I'd like to see a show of hands. How many people here read about the adoption prior or at the time of adoption back in, I'm guessing, 2010? Anyone? A few of you? Okay. Well, that was what we found in Indiana, so I was just surprised to know it was well publicized here. But essentially, I'd like to say to you, your position seems to be that if you had better standards, you perhaps would have adopted the Common Core, and that you wouldn't be concerned. And I'm here to tell you, you should be concerned, because the issue of the fuzzy math, which I started out with, that is very different. And I'm not an expert on Ohio's former standards, so you all may know otherwise. But in Indiana, our old standards didn't dictate. They didn't contain pedagogy as the Common Core does. So if you liked the fuzzy math, if your school and you chose to do the fuzzy math, fine. If you didn't and you liked more traditional math, you could do that. The Common Core standards does contain fuzzy math pedagogy in the practice standards. It does. And that is why you're seeing so many textbooks, even Saxon math, being rewritten in ways that would shock you. When I read a sample problem from Saxon on their new Common Core line math book for 3rd grade, and I just randomly clicked on it, the first thing that came up said, students will get in groups and act out the problem, then they will move on to drawing pictures of the problem. I never thought in my wildest dreams I'd see those words in a Saxon math textbook. But regarding the math standards, they are not high quality, internationally benchmarked. After we looked at what Professor Milgram had to say about it, we also looked at what some of the people on the feedback committee. So there was a validation committee and there was a Common Core feedback committee where people put it was basically like a suggestion box. They never got together and met. It was a call in and give us your feedback. And one of the people that served on that was Dr. Fabio Milner, a professor who was at Purdue University but is now at Arizona State University. And he sent us a letter with his opinions, and I won't read the whole thing, but the final sentence says, I can unequivocally recommend that Indiana not adopt the Common Core math standards if the state wants to require high school graduates from the state to excel by design to a higher level than average. Is that what you want here in Ohio? Average? Because that's not what I want. And further validating that notion, Jason Zinba, the writer of the math standards himself, has publicly testified that by design, the Common Core math standards were to prepare students for a 2-year non-select community college, not a 4-year university. So this notion that these are, high standards that are going to just shoot us, to the top, is simply wrong, and it's a myth.
We just have 2 minutes for Joy, or one of you to wrap up.
All right, well then I'll just go ahead and hand it to Joy. But again, I'd just like to say the biggest problem with this is when you have a problem, the distance between the parent and the child in the classroom and those who can fix it is now outside the state of Ohio. They are owned and copyrighted. They cannot be edited, changed, or deleted, not one word. I think that's a problem.
Before Joy speaks, if you want to speak, pass your card with your name on it to the center aisle. They're going to bring those down to me, and then we'll call you up to ask your question. But pass them to the center aisle so we can do that. And I want crisp questions, not speeches, so we can move this through. Go ahead.
Since my colleagues are talking about all the big picture items, I'll just go to actually talk directly about a couple of things that in the rebuttals have come out. And the first one is that the data system in Ohio, despite what Ohio has right now for its data system, the state has signed that agreement that I read to you from that said it will change its data systems and its laws and regulations to conform with the federal agreement that it signed to have the sort of data system that I require. So as the legislature, I recommend that you take a look at that memorandum of agreement. with the federal government and ensure that the data is protected for your students. The second item is if we're talking about the impacts on private schools, we have several state board members, saying that they will not require Common Core private schools, but I believe, and anyone can correct me, any point where the state requires voucher schools to administer the state test, that's a Common Core test, and therefore you're looping them right into the same feed system, that all the schools are being connected to. Second of all, every single test almost, I've been researching this, is now connected to Common Core. So the Sanford 10 Achievement Test is aligned with Common Core. The Iowa Basic Test aligned with Common Core. The SAT and ACT tests are aligned with Common Core. The subject, the grades 3 through 10 ACT branded tests, they're aligned with Common Core. So what we're seeing is the schools who want different tests or districts who want to use different tests in the interim around the school year, they basically have no options but Common Core aligned tests at this point. So this is an entirely central, feedback system that we're talking about. The second is that even private schools and home schools are noticing that the curriculum that they choose, besides if you want a child to go to college, they have to pass the ACT and SAT, right? So that's Common Core material your child has to be accustomed to. But the curriculum is such that even states and schools that are not have not adopted Common Core are likely to use Common Core textbooks and materials because basically all the publishers has switched around. As Heather mentioned, the adoption is almost complete even in the private market now as well.
All right, we're going to try to do these questions. Thank you all very much. First question I have, let me get Sally Herwood on the deck. Come on up, and I'm going to read one while we're doing that. This is from Larry Stewart, Field Local Schools. He's a school board member. Where's Larry? Is this directed to anybody, or you want one from each side?
Oh, it doesn't matter.
Okay, I want 1 minute from each side. You guys decide. Who, what group will decide, and how Common Core will be implemented? Who will decide what is in the curriculum? Anybody on this side?
I'm not exactly sure.
This one's not working. Oh, I didn't have it on.
Are you asking who were the people who wrote the Common Core standards? Who are the people implementing it in Ohio?
Well, where's all the curriculum? Where's the information coming from? Somebody has to be responsible for gathering it all and passing it out to everyone. Am I kind of wrong in thinking that? Well, then where did it come from? I mean, it didn't just come out of thin air. Yeah, I'm just wondering.
Andrew Brenner.
Well, I actually was on a conference call a few weeks ago discussing C-Scope, which I'm sure a few of you have heard about. A lot of these, you got to remember, the curriculum is written by publishers and they need to make a profit. So they're going to go to the states that have the largest number of students. Well, one of them is Texas and one of them is California. So if they can get the curriculum approved in those states, guess what? They're going to try to sell it in the other states as well. Now with digital technology and everything else, I think we can get around some of that. But the reality is you can actually adopt, and here in Ohio, your local school boards make the decision on the curriculum. So I would advise the local school board members read the textbooks.
So the development of the Common Core was funded by the Gates Foundation, and in particular then it was developed by a group called Achieve Inc., which is a private entity that's governed by it was created by the National Governors Association. There's 3 governors who sit on the board, and then 3 corporate executives who sit on the board. So it gets back to this very much a corporate-driven, foundation-driven effort here.
I'd like to add, someone mentioned social studies standards, and they are developing social studies standards. The CCSSO is in the process, and Ohio is listed as one of the states involved in that. And when I found that out, I thought, well, I'll try to find out who's writing them. I called CCSSO and I asked, could I please find out the list of the individuals writing these standards? I thought I'd get a jump start on the front end rather than back end. It is not available for public information. It is being done behind closed doors once again, and that is what happened with the writing of the math and ELA standards.
Kelly's going to wait.
Hey, yeah, sorry, I'm not on the panel, but let me answer that. Now, this is my 4th year on the school board. Not for a second do they ask my opinion on curriculum. Not for a second. In fact, I got school board members in here. In fact, if we ask a question about a textbook we're supposed to be adopting, we're told we're micromanaging, we're not being a good school board member, we're not playing the game. This is not up to your school board, trust me. When we ask financial questions, that's as far as we can go.
Sally, come on. Here we go. We're going to keep this moving. We got to do a lot of questions.
Okay, my question is for those that are in favor of Common Core. Did you hear anything from your opponents that will change your mind and or from the response of the audience as to our opinions?
Well, first of all, I'm for higher standards in the Common Core and standards that we adopt here in the state of Ohio. So let me make that perfectly clear. Second, your local school boards, you know what, your superintendents, you're supposed to be the check and balance to the superintendent administrations for your local schools. And I talked to I don't know how many school board members that basically say, well, what do you need? And I'm sorry, no, you are supposed to be asking a question. We've got a school board member here this evening, or here today, who I know from our local school district, and I'm going to tell you, he's the one person that's standing up locally and questioning literally everything, including the textbooks. And even if your superintendent and a couple of your other school board members say, no, that's not to be talked about, baloney. You have the right to talk about it, you have the right to bring it up, and I suggest that you start doing it.
The next, hold on. We're just going to keep moving. I know. You get the last word. Kelly, you hold all that and you get the last word. We have a lot of questions. Jerry Foy, come up here, Jerry. And on deck is Wendy Seacrest. Come on up, Wendy. Jerry, quick, crisp question.
Well, it's really a comment.
No comment.
No comment? All right. Well, how about the state of Ohio create the standards? Yeah. Instead of a Common Core.
Yeah, the short answer is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you do something. And there is wait. Is this a process where I answer questions or I'm shouted down? Because I want to answer the question.
Respect for our guests. Respect for our guests, guys.
The answer to the question is there is nothing wrong with utilizing that which is up to the standards that we want. I don't design my own car. I don't design my own lettuce. I don't design my own instruction books on how to repair my plumbing. I look for valuable ones that are out there and I pick the best one that I think I can do. We could develop them. But I'll remind you that this state has seen a massive economic decline in tax revenues. I don't support higher taxes, but it's a reality, and let me be clear, I don't want higher taxes. I want taxes cut for developing economic growth. But I assure you that the most responsible thing to do is look around for ways to standard and templates that can be used on which we can drive our own standards. And the fact is, we have standards right now that are inferior to the standards under the Common Core.
I have a quick thing to add about that. Dr. Sandra Stotsky, who had a large hand in writing Massachusetts top in the nation standards, has created her own set of free and changeable standards that she's given release for any state to use. So she's basically like, use my brain, use my expertise, do whatever you want with them. So at least half of the work would be done for you already.
All right, I'd like Lee Hunter and Vicki Roholt to come up. You guys are on deck. Lee Hunter and Vicki Roholt. This is Wendy Seacrest from Kettering City Schools. Quick question.
Going under the understanding that we can pick the curriculum, we've heard for years and years teachers teach to the test. So is that a national test that the teachers are using now, or is it state run? And will the testing be the national test that we are going to be that they will tend to teach to?
There is no national test. The test that is used right now in Ohio is an Ohio test. We just scrapped an Ohio test, the Ohio graduation test, and we're going to have Ohio end-of-course exams as the basis of graduation, and we're going to have Ohio-approved tests. Whatever test we run in the state will be one that is approved either by the state board or the legislature for achievement purposes, but for substance, you pick those tests. You and your local districts decide what is being assessed. And I assure you there's great variation in this state on the curricula used, and the Common Core standards being adopted in this state do nothing to change them.
Governor Kasich has put into his budget a line item for the state to join park testing. That's one of the national tests. And when we say national, that basically means there's different, groups of some 20 states across the country and national unelected bureaucrats creating those tests right now that are set to roll out for 2014 and 2015. So Ohio is online, at least the folks in government in Ohio are online to join the park consortium. They're in the park consortium. Governor's put the money in his budget for the tests. That's the track that Ohio's on right now. And as I mentioned earlier, all the other tests, Iowa Basic, SAT, ACT, those are all already aligned.
That's only if we approve it.
And I'd also like to add that the park test is federally funded. It was created with federal funds. And the other problem that I don't think we've mentioned is that you will no longer control your cut score. Where your cut score is set, you are now ceding control to, you are now 1 of 22, whereas before, you're 1 of 1. If they set it too low, you haven't solved any problems whatsoever. But we don't know where they're going to set it.
Next question is Lee Hunter, Worthington School District.
This could be answered either by Mr. Jones or Mr. Brenner. I see that you all do have some concerns with this. And what I don't understand is why, and I think everybody here knows where this is headed. This is only just the beginning of where this is going to be taking. So I don't understand why you two want all of us to just roll over and play dead, give up, standards are bad. Why can't we come back now that we know what is going on? Why can't we stand up and change it and make Ohio better?
Absolutely. I think you should. Look, I'm sitting in the Ohio House Education Committee. Believe me, I know exactly what's going on the other side of the aisle because they're there constantly pushing their ideas and ideology on everybody else. That's why when they went completely ballistic when we passed Senate Bill 165 last year and put the founding documents actually in as a requirement to be taught. But every one of you, I'm absolutely glad. You need to stand up and raise what for. You need to go to your local school boards. You need to go to your superintendents. You need to go and start raising what for. Write letters to the editor. I do that. I'm in complete agreement.
So do you think that we would be better off as a state changing and making our standards higher? Or do you think Common Core is better?
I think Common Core is better. I think we can do other better means. We can have higher standards through other means. But the fact is, I want to see the alternative on the table. And I'll tell you, after being around Ohio politics for 8 years and national politics for 15 before that, I want to remind you, people could talk a good game about this is what I'll vote for, but plenty of conservatives crumble under the pressure and they'll dumb down standards. You say, I want high standards? People can do that till the cows come home. This man won't, but I assure you, folks will say that and then they'll undermine it as they go. I'm out here right now telling you I want high standards and I'm sticking by them. I'm not elected, I'm an appointed official. We're a majority elected board. But that's the reality. If you don't like it, talk to your elected officials and propose an alternative. Say what you want. Don't say I don't like the Common Core. Say here's what I want to do in the alternative.
Let me tell you this. We had, I think, in the bill last year, Governor Kasich had promoted because he's really pushing for a lot higher standards and a lot higher accountability. We had a debate in the Education Committee, and this is coming from the educators, and a couple of these other representatives are from the other side of the aisle, and they were arguing about whether or not we should set some sort of minimum passing standards. The standards right now, I think, are so low that I think in the test, if you get 30%, you're passing. 35%. My apologies. 35% and you're passing. That's a disaster. I am sorry, but our side of the aisle, I'm going to tell you, the Republicans, and even the Republicans, if you look at them from when they were coming from initially on these Common Core, and where Bill Gates, talk about a capitalist. The only reason he's got all that money is because of capitalism and he raised it. He was so concerned about the United States of America falling behind every other country on the planet, and not just a little bit, we were getting blown out by all these other countries on the planet. Now, I'd like to implement Milton Friedman style free market type based systems where you do have high standards, but let every student go to whatever school they choose, because the free market will work.
Bill Gates is, I don't think of Bill Gates as a capitalist, I think of him as a corporatist. The thing is I sense on the other side here, maybe there's some openness to improve standards, and I think if you look at the Common Core and what it ushers in, it really is a bucket of junk. And maybe they could start on a few places where they'd like to improve the Common Core. For instance, the trend in America for the last 15 years or so was to put Algebra 1 into 8th grade, and then that allows a more comfortable logical progression of math up to get to calculus comfortably by 12th grade. Common Core puts Algebra 1 basically back into 9th grade. And then their rebuttal is, well, we have this accelerated program whereby you can get to calculus by 12th grade. The problem with that, and California has the numbers to back that up, the problem with that is that when California, for instance, moved Algebra 1 to 8th grade, what happened, there was a disproportionate rise in children from low-income families who suddenly started getting the calculus in 12th grade. And the reason for that is when you have that accelerated program, the people who are most able to avail of that are those from well-to-do families who can hire tutors, afford summer courses and things of that nature. So there's a very, very profound equity issue as to why Algebra 1 should be in 8th grade, why a state should reform its Common Core.
Okay, we're going to bring me Justin Smith, Jeremy Anderson, and Susie Needler. Come on up on deck. We've got Vicki Roholt from the Plain Local School District in Canton.
Okay, I think a lot of people here are a little concerned with the direction of our government these days. And as we've seen, the federal government taking more and more control of our school, we've seen our international rankings go down and down continuously. When I was in school, we were right up there in the top 10, and now we're, what, 26th out of 35 or something? But we're really low. So what we're doing is giving up our control of the school system, giving it to the federal government, which in times is... Okay, I'm getting to that. Well, there was probably an infamous quote that people all know about, he who owns the youth gains the future. My question is, how do we know that the federal government in a changing world, how do we know that the federal government is going to make the right decisions on the standards, whatever curriculum you use to get to those standards is going to be the right one?
Well, folks, the federal government, I keep saying this, the federal government is not deciding the standards. I know you don't believe that, but ultimately there is a point of approval, a point of final approval where we go into this, where the legislature agrees to, here's going to be the standards framework, and we as a state board set up those standards and implement them. As I've said, I believe the Common Core is going to break up before it reaches the finish line. It's going to do so, in my opinion, because I think some states are going to demand cut scores that are much lower than Ohio wants, and I'm one of the members pushing for higher standards. And the reason I'm doing that is that is what is important. If that breaks apart the park, then we'll do something else. But we're going to have higher standards in this state.
Governance of the standards is a problem, so says the Fordham Institute.
Justin?
So you have the federal government pushing the issue from the testing consortia. Then you have the standards, which are owned by the National Governors Association and Council of Chief State School Officers. So the Fordham Institute, let's just say really quickly, issued a report a couple of years ago saying, well, going forward, we have to look at governance of the standards. So in the past, a state could sit down and make the decisions by themselves. But if you're in the Common Core system, then you have a collection of states, and the Fordham report said, well, you got that collection of states, then you have the federal government and the private foundations. All of those are going to be weighing in to govern the standards. Do we change them? Do we upgrade them? How do we validate them? And those pressures, we have precedent to see how that plays out, and that's how the Common Core itself was developed. The Fordham Institute, I'll just read you, they came up with, they said there's three possible ways we could govern the standards. We could have a powerful centralized entity, which it called, let's become more like France. We could have a small entity charged with updating the standards, but otherwise leaving these issues to be addressed as they arise. And they could have a middle ground, which features an interim coordinating council that might evolve into something more permanent and ambitious over time. And that coordinating council was what they recommended. They said, well, we could have about maybe a dozen people on that. We could have people from the federal government. We could have people from MGA, CCSSO. You know, they had a list of interest groups and associations that would have representation on it. And of course, they didn't suggest not one member from a state. So it's a huge problem going forward.
Thank you very much. Next is Justin Smith, Fremont City Schools.
My main question is for the supporters of this. This is an unproven system. And I just want to know, why couldn't we have some districts try it out and see if it works rather than signing the whole state of Ohio and do something that is totally unproven and created by individuals who do not necessarily have education experience or background.
Well, districts are. I mean, districts have the ability, you right now have the ability to implement your own standards and push them. I know, like I said, we've got a local school board member here in this district, in this school district, who's doing that. But there's only one school board member. If you get enough of your school board members to do that, raise your standards. I mean, if it was up to me, I'd get rid of the U.S. Department of Education.
Is Susie Needler up here? She's not here. Oh, that is Susie? Okay, let's come on up closer. And next after her is going to be Karen Renner, Natalie Chubb, and Carol Bicking. And I don't know if I'm going to have any more time for any others. Come on up, Jeremy. Jeremy Anderson from the Worthington School District.
Yes, my question, Mr. Jones and Mr. Brenner, both of you have mentioned, and I respect that on your watch these types of concerns, whether it's data mining, the move to a national curriculum would not happen. Why should we put in place a vehicle that someone down the road who may have other nefarious intentions could potentially use that while you're not on the watch?
Let me say before he does that, this was my question, okay? And what I'm hearing here today, the question is control of the curriculum and testing. We want that at the local district. The question that everybody has is, we don't trust our federal government. The slippery slope question. Assume you're right. Just assume you're right. Tell us why we're not going to be down the slippery slope in 20 years, 10 years, 5 years.
Well, you know, there are a lot. Okay. There are a lot of things that are possessed by government that, if misused, could be problematic. You know, we have a large cache of weapons and defense equipment down here at the local National Guard Armory that theoretically could be turned on people. But that's not going to happen because we have a...
Respect our guests.
Don't say stupid stuff.
Folks, that theoretically could be used on people, but it hasn't been. And, you know, we go back to the Detroit riots, for example, when the National Guard is called out, or Los Angeles riots. So I don't want to say never. But the responsibility of a government is internal vigilance. And having data systems in place, they're already in place. And frankly, folks, if you believe that state data systems have a power of information over your children, then where are you about the broad use of information in a commercial basis that's already adopted by the internet? How deeply and by the way, I am a deep opponent of centralized data systems, and I've done it throughout my career. I've been on the losing side for 15 years. but I'm also smart enough to recognize it's already a lot worse in the commercial realm. The data stored on this thing, and your home computer tells more people more about you and your kids and your family than these state data systems ever will. And if you're worried about the government using it, they can tap those very same resources if that's what they desire.
My question, or my answer would be, is you modify the Ohio Constitution. And you put an amendment out there like we've done in the past, and you put it in the Ohio Constitution, because right now the law basically says you can't use these data systems for things. The law currently says, you know, that we have local control. Now those laws can be changed if, say, the Ohio House ever becomes a Democrat and the governor flips. So the only way you can actually guarantee that is you change the Ohio Constitution.
Well, with respect to data, the administration changed the regulations so that private entities can receive student-level data. And the second thing, you know, I think with respect to the idea that we have a military maybe that'll turn on the people or something, I think that gets back to the idea of the Constitution and the checks and balances that were in there and the underlying philosophy, and that the federal government would have certain powers and duties and the state government would have certain powers and duties. And those checks and balances were put in there with a view as to what the functions of each of those governments would be. And the danger is when you start giving to the federal government, or vice versa, duties that really belong to the state government. And that's what's happened here. And that's why it's a problem.
All right, next is Susie Needler of Worthington School District.
Thank you. Heather, you pointed out the dangers of the fuzzy math, and I wanted to ask about the dangers of the fuzzy writing on page 7 that the supporters of the Common Core point to as being more rigorous, saying, given a creative writing prompt, students produce a writing sample that uses mechanics, grammar, and conventions of writing that's scored against a predetermined rubric, which is a silly way of saying right. And I want to ask you also about the fact that when teachers are mandated to teach to these tests, they are told to make the students read the questions first before they read the selection. And instead of reading with an open mind, say Shakespeare, and discovering layers of meaning, they read whatever the people who set the questions think is important. And that is terribly dangerous.
If you want to know more about looking at the literature of the English Language Arts Standards in Common Core, I recommend that you look at Dr. Sandra Stotsey's work. And she basically calls them empty skill sets. So what we know about literature is that it is important, like you mentioned, for children to read and think about and discuss that. And rubrics are helpful for kind of guiding discussion or knowing what is generally important to pull out. But it becomes less than helpful, like you mentioned, when teachers, that is what takes up all of their class time because they're fitting all of these different, checks and that they have to mark off on the boxes that they can't get to what the students are actually interested in.
I would say that is largely a practice of an individual teacher, and I would hope that my son wouldn't be in a class where that was the approach he was taking with him, and he would have that opportunity to read the text and digest it and then respond to questions. And I think that's where this, again, curriculum, local control, what your district is saying your teachers should be doing is really, really important. They don't have to adapt those strategies in order to teach the material.
All right, next is Karen Renner, our Hoosier here from the Wani Community School Corporation in Napanee, Indiana. How about that?
Hi, I drove here 5 hours to be here because I'm a school counselor in Napanee, and we have a great school district, we have great parents, we have great teachers, we have great administrators, and a great school board. they know nothing about what Common Core is or how we got involved in it. And if they knew, they would be marching in the streets. I would like to know what your advice is, and I'm talking to the pro side here. What is your advice for a person within a school corporation how to inform the population without getting fired?
I really appreciate you coming, and I really appreciate you speaking out, because, to be honest, that's what it's going to take. But I think the stakes are higher enough that it's necessary. And when I found out about this, it wasn't comfortable for me either. I didn't want to go travel around the state of Indiana talking about Common Core, but I decided I had to. And now we have, hundreds of parents around Indiana. I think a testament to the uproar and the disapproval of the Common Core is the fact that our former superintendent, Tony Bennett, who was a lead advocate of Common Core, lost his seat this past November when he was up for re-election over the Common Core issue. And it's a bipartisan issue. It draws in both Republicans and Democrats, teachers and parents. And I would implore the teachers who are here to begin sending letters to the editor. If you don't want to send it in your local community, send it, in another part of the state, because we need to hear from the many, many teachers who have privately told me they do not like the Common Core, but like you said, they're fearful of their jobs. I would recommend that they say a prayer and speak up anyway.
By the way, we're going to wrap up after 2 more questions. But if anybody else drove 5 hours, you're allowed to come up, okay?
On record that you want that not shared anywhere as personal information of hers. I also recommend to parents, depending on your school district, don't give them your child's social security number. That's not a recommended practice for school districts to collect that unless they need that for some other particular reason. But generally, educationally, school districts don't need the SSN, so it's safer data-wise if you don't provide that to the school. And the second thing on the opt-out form, there actually is a Common Core opt-out form online at truthinamericaneducation.com. So if you go there, print it out, and bring it to your school principal, your school can't actually opt out of Common Core because, well, they have to, have the test, they have to do the state accountability, so on and so forth. But it's a great way to start a conversation. It's a great way to get your principal knowing that you're really concerned about this, and so on and so forth. It's just a one-page thing. You can download it free, sign your name to it, and bring it in. truthinamericaneducation.com.
Can I respond to that comment or to her question?
Folks, I'm in New Albany. I drove here, I live the far side of New Albany, so it took me 25 minutes to get here. It's not far to go. We are implementing Common Core math. It is resulting in some of our 7th graders taking algebra. That didn't happen before. We are moving it down. We're doing it as part of our district's effort to raise the performance of children. It is for your school board member in here, it is in your power to set higher standards than the Common Core. It is in your power to tell your superintendent to change the curriculum to raise it. If you have naysayers, fight back against them. That's why you got elected. That's your job. I do my job, and that's your responsibility.
All right, final questions from Carol Bicking of the Licking Heights School District.
What would be the roadblocks involved with adopting the Massachusetts standards here in Ohio? If they're great, who or what would be against them?
The governor is, in fact, that's what we tried to do last year. Our own roadblocks are actually with many members within our party, but the other side of the aisle just demagogued us and said that you're going to harm children and it's going to, make them, their self-esteem go away. I mean, we implemented last year the 3rd grade reading guarantee here in Ohio. And the reason we did that is because we want to make sure that the students are able to read by the time they're in the 3rd grade because they have to learn content after that. We were being told by the other side of the aisle that this was going to be a complete disaster for our schools, that the kids are going to be just, it's going to be devastating, we're going to hold all these kids back. No, we're not going to do that. We're going to improve and go beyond that.
One last comment on this side.
Well, I'll say this as Heather and Joy and Heather's colleague in Hoosiers Against Common Core know, over the last year, there's interest in repealing Common Core is growing both among Democrats and Republicans. They have Democrat sponsors in both the House and the Senate. So that's number one. Number two, so I would say bring it up again about if you want to bring Massachusetts standards in, bring the issue up again, and if the other side of the aisle objects, you could refer them to President Obama's speech in March 2009 before the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, that's before the Common Core was written, where he said, I think every state should have standards like Massachusetts.
All right. Thank you all very much. Now listen, I helped Kelly off. She has a lot to say, so she gets the last word. This is her party. I want to tell you one more time, on the back of your brochure, OSBLC.org, please join. I want 200 memberships out of this fantastic forum. The second thing I want to say is, I'm an attorney. We appear in court. And the theory in our court system in America is an adversarial system. You have the pro, you have the con, and then the judge decides. But you have to have that vigorous debate that gets you the good result. And I want to thank all of our panelists for presenting honest, compelling points of view. Obviously, for you all to come out and spend 2.5 hours on a Saturday, you feel passionately about one side or the other of this issue. I'm thanking you for showing respect to our panelists. I want the brilliance we have up here gives me faith and hope in America that we can solve our problems, honestly. And I say this to people all the time. We do not have people in France marching in the streets for smaller government. Okay? We do have that in America. And we have wonderful people like this who are willing to give their time to make the system better. We have hope in this country. We have a lot of hope. It's fantastic. Give it to Kelly for the final word. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, very much. He drove from Cincinnati. Good friend. I call on him quite a bit. But thank you all for coming. I thought they were awesome questions. They were to the point. They're exactly what we're all concerned about. Thank you for the answers. They were great. They were on point. It sounds like we have a lot in common. The concerns from even the supporters are a match to the concerns of those opposed. And I have to say, school board, if I were ever to ask a question about curriculum, what I get is a nonstop barrage of, you are not a curriculum expert. You have no business asking me anything about curriculum. So to ask a school board member that's paid $125 per meeting, I make $250 a month, to all of a sudden become a curriculum expert and manage the curriculum is way too much to ask of your school board. To think that that would be one of their responsibilities, I think is just insane. What we can do is hold people accountable. The difference between OSBLC and another organization, I'll just say, is that they don't encourage school board members to hold their school systems accountable. We do, and we coach them. He's talking about Adam White on the Olentangy School. Adam White, and he lives right here, and I thank you for saying that because Adam White is on the board of OSBLC. He's just like me, but I'm telling you, I asked one question one time about curriculum. We got threatened by the ACLU and the Freedom from Religion. I was on the front page of the newspaper the next day. I asked one question about our curriculum, adopting one 5th grade science textbook, and that's what I got. So I think it's way too much to ask of us to get into the curriculum unless I can get, $60,000, $70,000 a year and I'll get into the curriculum. But I'm not an expert. It's too much to ask. I can ask about our quiz scores, ask why a lot of our students are getting proficient and not above that. There's a whole lot of things school boards can do to hold their district accountable. Curriculum's not one of them, I'm just saying. Okay, so thank you guys for coming. I really need your support, OSBLC. Please go on and become a member. We need more membership because people are not going to listen to what we have to say at the state level until we have enough people listening to what we have to say. So help me out. We have a school board candidate workshop. It'll be our second for this year. If you're interested in running, June 22nd right here, you go to our website and it'll say, let's see, activities or events. You click on that. June 22nd right here, we're going to hold a 4-hour training. We already did one March 16th. We will hold another in August. And again, we're trying to make them as low cost as possible, so donations are always what helps us do that. But we want to start coaching school board members on how to hold their districts accountable. We had a projected $30 million budget deficit that we turned into a $12 million surplus without new money. So, can it be done? Absolutely. And guess what? Our academic success is higher than it's ever been. So, it didn't take money, it took accountability. That's what he said. Thank you all for coming. This guy in the purple shirt or any table will accept your little card. So leave that for us. We like to get to know where people are coming from to our events. Thank you very much.